So when I started, it was 1999, and that was the very just height of the possible peak of the apex of the internet boom. And venture funds were popping up everywhere until 2001. And then the bubble bursts and the whole thing explodes. And you were instrumentally involved in the creation of a whole bunch of it.
It's stories like that you only hear from someone who's had over 2 decades of experience.
Every dang day over the last 3 months, it's like, gosh, this great decision that I made, and I'm so energized. And even as being an old guy, this is really exciting stuff.
Today's episode is sponsored by VXT, the phone system built for law firms. VXT integrates with practice management systems so that when lawyers make calls, their billable time and legal advice can be saved in the right place automatically. 20% of billable time goes unrecorded. A lot of that is phone calls that get forgotten about. Get some of those billables back using VXT. Go to vxt.co.nz or click the link in the description to find out more.
Welcome to another episode of the File Notes podcast. Shane, you've had quite the journey from meeting 6 US presidents to founding a venture fund involving Snoop Dogg. Before we dive into all of these big moments that I'm sure everyone would love to hear about, what were you like as a kid? What was it like growing up in Wyoming?
Gosh, it was wonderful. So for those that aren't familiar, sort of Wyoming is in the middle of the United States, and it's like living on the moon in many places. It's pastures and prairie lands and giant mountains, but literally no humans. It is the least populated state in the union. And so not a lot of people, but I grew up in the town called Laramie, which is the situs of the only 4-year college in all of Wyoming, the University of Wyoming. My dad was a English professor there. My mom was the student's attorney. And so as a kid, I was into sports and mischief and hunting and fishing. And a lot of people that I knew had ranches. And so we would help out with livestock. And it was this wonderful amalgamation of just country life but having my parents who were from the New York City area and almost completely like Martians on the moon living in Wyoming, New Yorkers. It was a very almost sketch comedy like existence in many respects, with parents with thick Brooklyn and New York accents and living out in the country. And it was wonderful. It was just the people of Wyoming are incredible. They're just open and completely generous with their time and their spirit. And it was a great existence. Living in Wyoming as a kid, was wonderful times.
You mentioned your mum was an attorney and you have ended up being an attorney yourself.
Yeah.
I'd love to know if she ever shared any stories that compelled you to become an attorney yourself, or that really got you interested in the profession.
Yeah, I think not necessarily any like words of advice, but just the kind of human she was. And she's since passed, and she's the wonderful light of my whole life and the person I take all of my spirit and direction from. But it was more just as a young child, just observing her, being in her office, and she's on a call with a client and I'm sitting in the corner and reading through a book or doing some homework and just being around a lawyer who's in the law. You just find a vibe and you just get a cool sense that something important is happening without understanding absolutely anything that's going on. And it was always so cool just to watch her work and be on calls and yet remain deathly silent, lest there be repercussions at home had I said a word during her calls. But it was more just the kind of person that she was, so diligent, and the kind of attention she gave her clients. And so I think it's more the aspect of just viewing her as a professional and picking up on that, I'm sure subconsciously somewhere, to decide that this is something that I wanted to do as a living. And so through a very circuitous route, Sophie, that I know you and I have talked about, my life took a turn to the law, and here I am today.
Yeah. So tell me about your education. How did you end up doing a law degree?
Yeah. So I was a political science and history major at the University of Wyoming. So that's where I did my undergraduate studies. I also played on the baseball team, and as I played in the minor leagues in baseball, I did not immediately go into professional life, at least with the Oregon between my 2 ears. I was a baseball player for about 3 years professionally, but then realized that probably was going to be a much longer road to far less success. And I just made a career choice to do something different. And I leaned heavily on my political science degree. And so I went from being a baseball player to wanting to work at the United States Congress for the senator from Wyoming, an amazing man by the name of Alan Simpson, Big Al, as we call him, for those that know him. And just, it was that experience of getting to work as in the legislative side of things, I think, along with probably having that sort of, again, granular pieces of magic instilled in me from my experience, but to watch my mom as a lawyer, I think all of that sort of directionally headed towards being a lawyer at some point. So when I got done with my 3 years on Capitol Hill working for Senator Simpson, then I knew I wanted to be a lawyer of some kind. And it was a very circuitous route, again, to what I thought I wanted to do to what I actually wound up doing. So, but that's the genesis of kind of at least the guts of where we started, the journey.
And so when you were working on Capitol Hill, was there a particular moment or policy discussion that you realized, oh, I'm going to go do my law degree now?
Yeah, I think so. So when I was at Senator Simpson's office, I worked. Yeah, he was the minority whip at the time. That is, he was a Republican senator. I was a token Democrat on an all Republican staff, but they still treated me very well. And when that experience was working with the constituents on a day-to-day basis, the people from the great state of Wyoming with their problems and their issues, and getting a chance to talk to them about the ways in which we, as helping Al as a legislator, put the law down on paper. I think for me, just working with people and ultimately drafting the law, that together resembles what I do now working with clients. And so I just love that. I loved working with the constituents. I loved having a lot of conversations with them with respect to their problems and their issues, and being in a position to help them in many respects. And so that to me, I think, began the aha moment of exactly what it is, what I thought I wanted to do, become a lawyer of some kind, because I had seen the way in which my mom moved through the world and the value she brought to a lot of people's day. And I knew at that point, I think that is exactly where I wanted to head. I did not want to be a career politician. Making the sausage was enough for me. I did not need to be somebody out there ultimately being a politician, although I still do love politics and talk often with a lot of professional and private friends about it. But for me, I think it was just that ability to help people from that legal side, even though it was on the legislative side. I started to really think that is something that maybe was my life's calling.
And so now you're a venture fund lawyer. Did you always want to be a venture funds lawyer, or did you have another type of law that you were interested in?
Oh God, no! This was the last thing in the world. I didn't even know what venture capital was. I was a young, spry 20-something coming out of Capitol Hill. I had no idea. I really had no idea what any of it was. I just knew that I wanted to go to do something. But when I was on Senator Simpson's staff, I got to work a lot on environmental issues. And not surprisingly, being from a state like Wyoming that is very prodigiously outdoors oriented and is quite scenic and beautiful, the environment is something that sort of is near and dear to any Wyomingite's heart. And I thought that maybe combining that passion for the love of the outdoors and protecting the environment with the law might be a really cool way to spend one's day. And so the first notion I had is I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. And I thought that is absolutely sounded like a great job. And what better a way to spend your days than help protecting the environment and doing a lot of things that are definitely worthwhile. And so that's what I wanted to do. And so I applied to a number of law schools in the US that had focuses on environmental law, the University of Oregon being the number one school on that list. And I was lucky enough to get into Oregon and then went to Oregon with that in mind. But both you and I know that is not where the journey ends. It only just starts there. So
So you ended up at Cooley. Bridge me through that little gap of how you went from studying environmental law
yeah,
to working at Cooley, which is one of the largest and most known firms for venture fund formation.
yeah. So I wasn't fancy myself an environmental lawyer. First year of law school is the first year of law school, but when I actually started to get selecting the courses that I wanted to take, I took a number of environmental courses, and it turned out to be the most boring, awful thing that, at least for me personally, it was very highly regulatory based, and very few people get to actually do what you think environmental law is about. This was more just like reading through code of EPA protections. And there was just, it for me became not at all something that the image of what I thought environmental law was and what the actuality of it was, two completely different things. And so for me, that is not at all what I wanted to do. So I discovered that at about second year through law school. And then I had to redesign what in the world I thought I wanted to do. And then I took a bunch of tax courses just as part of kind of a corporate tax course. And I actually did really well in the class, and I actually really liked it. I've never been a numbers person per se, but I loved the way in which the course was taught, and the way in which that having really great tax counsel can be very important for a lot of reasons. And so that was the next thing that I thought I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a tax lawyer. So I took a whole bunch of tax courses at Oregon, and then decided that was going to be the future of my career. I wanted to be a tax lawyer, and an international tax lawyer at that. And so I designed the rest of my law school experience to do that. And then I actually, I graduated from the University of Oregon and then went to New York University, NYU. They have a sort of postdoctorate LLM program in tax, which is actually the best tax program in the world. And so I went there thinking, oh my God, this was going to be the best thing since sliced bread. And it was wonderful. I loved the academia and the challenge of doing the tax courses at NYU. It was terrific. And so I graduated from NYU knowing that, at least in my mind's eye, that's what I thought I wanted to do. And I took that tax degree and moved out here to the San Francisco Bay Area and started with what was then Price Waterhouse, which is now PricewaterhouseCoopers. And so I was working as an young international tax lawyer, which wound up all it was research and writing memos for clients, and never really talking to clients and never interfacing with clients. And all I ever got to do was talk to my bosses and discover a lot of things and help do a lot of research and writing. And that was it. And that was going to be it for the next 10 years. And as you can already see, I talk a lot, and I'm all about the people. I love sort of counseling individuals and businesses with respect to what they were doing, but I never really got a chance to do that very much. And so while tax law was certainly very challenging and rewarding from an intellectual standpoint, the real world aspect of working in a large accounting firm doing it wasn't something that I was going to be okay with. Ultimately, I decided, but wonderfully so, a large portion of my client base wound up being a bunch of venture funds and international venture funds. And so of the clients that I worked with, I really loved working with the venture funds. And for one, they were just great people, and their business was incredibly interesting. And they were doing things that were investing in some of the most incredible companies in the world. And the experience of doing that looked to me to be something that I really wanted to do. And so I left being an international tax lawyer. I wound up starting at Cooley in 1999, I think it was, and was at Cooley for 25 years until 3 months ago, when I left Cooley to become the head of the venture funds practice here at Sidley Austin. And so that's where you currently find me. And it took a little while to get there to find my passion in the law, but I absolutely love what I do. It is absolutely the bee's knees in terms of the corporate side of the law. You work with so many incredible people. Snoop Dogg being an example of somebody that I've gotten the privilege of working with along the way. And so it's been a wonderful career, just doing a lot of things with a lot of very interesting people, and have really found that to be something that I just have a true passion for.
Love the twisting and turning. I think it's something that everyone probably needs to do in their career to find where they actually want to land. And you ended up staying at Cooley for over 2 decades. What was
Yeah.
it like when you first joined Cooley, and how you evolved over your time there? I imagine everything would have
Yeah.
changed.
Oh
The firm
gosh.
would have grown.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. So when I started, it was 1999, and that was the very just height of the possible peak of the apex of the internet boom. And it was, law firms were hiring like crazy, and venture funds were popping up everywhere. And People, I remember as a young associate, I was working 300 billable hours a month, and it was bananas, all in a wonderful way because business couldn't have been better and people were doing it. Really, the internet and the internet venture capital community was at its infancy. And it was just incredible. I mean, it was just the most incredible place to be a part of. And you got a cup of coffee every now and then, and God forbid you actually got to eat, but it was super busy. And so until 2001, and then the bubble bursts and the whole thing explodes, and a whole bunch of venture funds and portfolio companies fold up shop. And it was terrible. You're so busy building so much, so many businesses starting, and then you see the whole thing collapse, and you were instrumentally involved in the creation of a whole bunch of it. And that's a personal pain that you take with you when you see a lot of people who became very dear friends, their businesses collapsed. And so I think when you go from the absolute height of the sort of internet economy to the very valley of the internet economy in such a short amount of time, you get a little stress and anxiety, and it was a very difficult time for a lot of people now, and law firms included. And law firms let go associates, and Cooley was no exception. When I was there, they let go of a number of associates because they hired too many, and that was the step. But that's not just a Cooley thing. That was every law firm, particularly in the Valley, and so it was terrible. I mean, for a while, it was terrible. But out of those ashes, you have to counsel, and you do it. And your job has become a very different thing than building up a bunch of new venture funds. It's these firms are now being torn apart, and people are fighting over the economic streams that are coming out of them. And so the way and the manner in which you counsel becomes a whole different thing. And it just becomes a different kind of day. And there's still funds being formed, but much more difficultly. And as we climbed out of that, and 2 or 3 years after that, you're back on the rise again. And so, but you take the lessons learned of that particular economy and how quickly things grew, and you keep those in the back of your mind. So like when 2008 rolls around and this last couple of years roll around, those are lessons learned from economies of past, like how to deal with it. So the first time I went through it, I knew nothing what I was doing. It was just like, people were calling up and they were crying, and people were fighting with each other. And you were a young lawyer and you had no idea what you were doing half the time. And it was trial by fire, and you just survived a lot of it. But you come out of that becoming a much better counselor and a much more sort of humanistic in the business that we do. These are not just transactions. These are people behind the transactions. And you have to understand and know that the way in which you interact with a client is not just about the transaction itself, it's about the people behind it. And so for me as a young lawyer, those were tremendous, valuable lessons learned. And so a guy with a lot more gray hair, at least in his beard now, I approach each day learning those lessons well, that again, in an economy like this, where it's very difficult, but I also have the perspective to know that this too shall pass. The economy may be a bummer for a while, but you just got to ride it out, and you got to be patient. And here's the things you do to survive and succeed and manage your portfolio companies and manage your portfolio and interact with your investors. And right. So these are all lessons that you learn when you go through this many years. And if I hadn't have gone through these 3 terrible economies through the course of my career, I wouldn't learn those lessons, and I wouldn't be of the kind of value that I am to my clients, who really rely on not just the legal acumen, but the business acumen. And how do you deal with this, not even from a lawyer's perspective, but from a business person's perspective? And so all of that sort of comes home to roost. And the firm changed, right? Cooley changed. They were very much based on the internet economy. They were venture capital, emerging companies, and it was hard. I mean, it was brutally hard. But management of the firm learned a lot of lessons and grew by hiring a bunch of lateral people in practices that were not traditionally Cooley. They were not emerging cap, and they became like a firm like I'm at now, Sidley, banking institutions and antitrust. And so building out the offering of legal services in a way that you can try to be more impervious from a bad economy hitting your particular strength or sector. So the firm grew in that way, which is great, because there was a lot of ways in which it was a tremendous thing. And so I think that there were lessons learned along the way from everybody's perspective and how to build the business right. And so as it grew through all of that, the recipe for success was there. And so I think you just hold your breath and know that it's all going to be okay, but you may have to sit through some difficult times, but you learn your lessons and build and counsel and continue to do the things that help you succeed. So lessons learned, no doubt.
Yeah, it's stories like that you only hear from someone who's had over 2 decades of experience in a
Yeah.
firm, so it's so fascinating hearing about that and the people element of it as well. You might hear of these books or movies about the valley during that time, but then to actually hear from someone who was actually there in the middle of it, you forget sometimes that it's not just a movie, especially if you're someone younger like me. I grew up when I was a child when that
Yeah.
was happening, so
Yep.
you only hear of it after the fact, so
Well, you're making me
kind
feel so good now, Sophie. That's great. Yeah. I mean, look, and when we have young associates here who just, this is their first time through a tough economy, and you just have to, again, at a human level, just everything, this is not anywhere near as bad as it was in '08 or even '01. It's difficult, but the industry has changed a little bit and it will come out of it. And you have to bear with it and everything's going to be okay. So I think from that perspective, it was something that it's valuable for clients, and in particular in a market like this, but it also is, they asked the question even before 2022 rolled around, this height of the highs in 2021, when the market again was not quite 1999, but getting up there. And what, they were careful. There was these scratching on the back of your brain. This can't continue on this way forever. How do we protect ourselves? And so you offer the advice. While you might not yet see it, there are things that are coming that you can plan for and predict and be able to absorb and not feel the shock and awe of what happened back in those economies. And that's the kind of counseling that really helps, particularly first time fund managers, because the business that I do, I represent people who have been doing this longer than I have, 30 years, 40 years, being VCs who were really started when the Valley started. But then I get to work with amazing people who are doing their first fund, young 20 people, something people who are coming straight out of college and have a great idea and have, access to capital, God bless them, and who have never experienced anything like this. And so being able to have that perspective, I think helps out tremendously.
And on the topic of young associates coming through, when you were a leader at Cooley and as a leader now, what kind of things do you see those who are progressing the fastest through their career or being able to provide the most value to their clients? What are they
Yeah.
doing at that early stage in their career?
Yeah, hungry to learn, I'll tell you what. And the piece of advice I give young lawyers consistently is never forget you are the master of your own future. And you can be assigned work and there will be tasks that you will be given, and you're staffed on teams or you're staffed on cases that really aren't of your choosing. But what you can do is make the most out of each of those experiences by having real deep conversations with the clients about a lot of stuff. And that's not even just about their business, that's just getting to know them as people. And so you've got to really view each client relationship for what it's worth. It's worth getting to know the actual client themselves, just at a personal level. And you should always be the captain of your own ship when it comes to what makes you, after a while, after you've been doing this for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, you start to understand what transactions you really like working on and what cases you like working on. And that's something that I think people don't have enough belief in to talk to their supervisors about, because this should always be a two-way street. It shouldn't just be very senior lawyers telling junior lawyers what's going on and what they're doing. And that the staffing will come, but what makes really great associates and really great lawyers are people who are very vocal for themselves, who know themselves about what transactions they're interested in and what are their pain points. I'm really struggling with X. Writing these kinds of memos is very difficult for me. Nobody as a young lawyer wants to admit they're struggling with anything. Know that it is 100% okay to do that. And that is actually the way you get better. So I would say seek out active mentorship. Hopefully there are people within your firms or whatever capacity you're at being a lawyer, if you're in-house counselor, find people who have done this a long time and have live conversations with them and talk to them a lot, because I think that and they'll become vested in your success. I mean, obviously I'm vested in the success of my associates because I want them to do well, not just because I want them to produce great work for my clients, but I care about them. I want them as people to succeed. And whether that is continuing on to be a partner here at Sidley, or if that's they've decided the law is not for them, because a lot of people in Silicon Valley make that decision. They don't want to be a lawyer anymore at a big firm. They want to go in-house to be a general counsel at a company or at a venture fund, or God forbid, they just hate the law altogether. They discover that there's a inflection point in their career. And there are plenty of people who have made that decision. And I think it's just counseling people to find their passion as well. And you got to be passionate about what you do to do it really well. And so you can be very smart and do a lot of things well, but I don't think that comes across as a saleable commodity unless people really believe you're vested in their success. And so the way you do that is you actually care a hoot about the success of these people. And it's obviously because you're giving them counsel and advice, but it's because you give a crap about who they are as people and you take the time to know who they are. So I think you just got to jump in all feet and all body parts into the pool quickly and immerse yourself in what it is. And it's not always an easy swim, and I know that, but the worst thing you can do is be super timid and dip your toes in. Like, it doesn't work a lot of times. And so I just think that you have the opportunity to really, and the more and more senior you get, then you really start to design like I only want to work with these clients and I only want to work in this space. And you really, but again, you have to be the captain of your own ship when you do that. And you have to be very vocal with your supervisors and the people that you're working with, if that's where you find yourself. And after a while, that's where you will find yourself. So like I, as a young lawyer, when I started at Cooley, I was doing both company side work, representing portfolio companies, and doing venture fund formation. And after a while, I decided that I really loved doing the venture fund stuff more than I did the company stuff. Not that I didn't not like working with companies, but I really just, for some reason, it's more of a people business. And so it's human capital. That's the currency of venture capital on the fund side. And so I was just really good at that. Talking to people and just the car salesman pitch tones that I have. But again, that all comes from passion. I love what I do. So to be allowed to talk about it anytime is a privilege for me. So you start to have young lawyers see that passion. Like, God, that sounds, people get really jazzed about it, working on clients that I'm working on, because they get to understand kind of the level of importance. And it's finding mentors that give you honest feedback, not just, hey, I wish you could write a memo that was half as long. No, you need to go out to more lunches with the clients, and you need to bug me about X, Y, and Z, and you need to go to this conference, and you need to go, right? So finding people in your atmosphere that can help make you better, but also not just having those people fall in your lap. Go find those people as well. I think it's super important to do that.
I love that. Some great advice. And throughout your career, you've spent most of your time in the Silicon Valley area.
Yeah.
It's a very innovative and lots of competition there for the type of work that you do. How
Yeah.
do you go about finding clients in this particular environment?
Gosh, that's a really apropos question right now, having switched firms and going from one of the two firms that is really the 800-pound gorilla in venture fund to a firm which is actually much, much larger and just has a very different sort of DNA and heritage to it, but has come to understand the importance of the venture capital community. And so I'm at a spot where business development is quite a bit of what I do, is always has been, but now it'll have to be, I just have to be much more scrappy about what I'm doing. So the things that I'm doing are the number one thing I do is continually work my network of contacts. And obviously over 25 years, I know a lot of people, both as venture capitalists or lawyers or service providers around the industry. And it's just taking people out to lunch, just learning what they're doing, showing a vested interest in kind of their success. It's taking a lot of those kinds of just easy meetings and even if it's people that I've met for the first time, I'd rather, again, it's easier coming out of COVID. I'd rather go to have a coffee than have a Zoom with somebody, because it's just a very different vibe, this business of venture capital. And so it is very network driven. And so a perfect example is I was just at a conference in Toronto called the L Suite, which is a wonderful organization that helps throw events for industry groups. And this was for the venture capital general counsel, or the VCGC group. So these are the general counsels who sit on venture funds, and they have their own conference. And so I went to that, and I convinced Sidley to be a sponsor of it. And I got to speak on a main stage panel and just be in the room with these GCs for 3 days. And it's swimming around. I mean, that's, shooting fish in a barrel, right? You have a captive audience where you really want to have a conversation about this new thing that I'm doing, building a practice from scratch with an incredible firm who has all these resources available to it, and having to sell that to a space which doesn't know the name of my firm in their space yet. So it's for me, it's been flexing a lot of really different muscles, but it's the reason I came here to build a business and do something so exciting. Like, the people I sit across from every day are business builders, and I've never really had the chance to do that at Cooley. And here it's just every day is so exciting. It's like taking calls with a number of new clients, or pitching a bunch of new clients, or hiring a bunch of new lawyers, or trying to convince them to come here to help me build a practice. And so all that is like working your network consistently, and it's taking advantage of industry opportunities, do conferences, get speaking opportunities. I think writing is important. So if you're on a blog, it's incredible to be able to do that, because I think, and it's pushing your content out with sites like LinkedIn. And so professionally getting the things that you're doing out in front of the right audiences. And in this age of social media, it's hugely important to be dialed into that. And know where the opportunities are for you going to be able to work your network and your business development genes, and B, allow you the opportunity to put forward your own content. And again, it can be podcasts, it can be blogs, it can be a number of things that you can do, industry newsletters, whatever it might be. I just think it's a very different. When I started a lawyer, like, the only way you would ever do this would be go to a conference. And that was the only thing you could ever do. There are so many opportunities to succeed from a business development standpoint, and you just have to take advantage of all of it. And you just have to consistently be present in the minds of the people to do this. And that is my task, is to make sure that people know that the venture fund formation practice at Sidley is fantastic, and we're ready to go and conserve, and are going to do an incredible job for you and have this deep expertise. But by God, it's not easy work. So you really got to explore all the avenues in which are impactful, because it's a very different world than it was 25 years ago of being able to do this. And I've been self-admittedly, I've been a old dog learning new tricks a lot of the time, but we have great marketing teams here at the firm, and it's relying on them to do help me with a lot of marketing for the practice and the firm. And so it's good stuff. It's professionalization of business development. It's order of magnitude times a million.
And with such a big change in your career, what surprised you the most?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was after 25 years of doing what I've done, being a counselor of venture funds, and my world was just very set. And so I just expected that to get transposed here. And man, did that notion get dispelled very quickly. It was, you have to discover new ways of doing things moment one. And the clients who come over, you have to introduce them to all new people. And it's not only selling this line of business to my potential clients, we got to make sure that the people inside the firm know about it. And so at Sidley, they've done a magnificent job of integrating me to the number of people I have met in my first 3 months here at the firm. It's probably 300 or 400, and that's just a drop in the bucket of the number of lawyers here at the firm. And I'm going to be going out to the different offices over the next couple of months, doing it like the Shane Goudey World Tour to meet everybody, not literally everybody, but the people who find that they may have business nexus with a venture funds practice. And so I think that for me will be something that's critically important. So I think it was just 25 years, you sit on the same nest every day. You don't have to really think about what life is like outside of it. And so I think here, everything is just new. Leading the group is a new thing. The new marketing, very sophisticated marketing practices that they have at Sidley, being able to tap into that. And it's just all brand new. The whole thing is brand new, which makes every dang day that I'm over the last 3 months is like, gosh, this is such the great decision that I made. And I'm so energized. And even as being an old guy, this is really exciting stuff. And so was one of the reasons I made the move was because I looked at the next 15 years of my career and I wanted it to be about something I could just really get excited about every day. And that is this. And it's like, it's terrifying many days. I have no idea, like on some days, who I'm supposed to be talking to about this matter or this expertise we have at the, and I just knew all that for 25 years at Cooley, right? And so that aspect of it is, as many people who build businesses, it's scary as hell. And so from that perspective, that was unexpected. I think being probably as terrified and unsure and anxious and all of that, but once you learn very quickly, the people that you're surrounded by at your new firm are just all in it for your success, and you just take stock in that, and then you start to really believe in all of it. And I think anybody who's ever built a business has felt the same way. But for me, that was the lesson learned here, is that it's okay to be uncomfortable because you're going to be that way for a while. It's probably a good thing.
I love how you said that it was terrifying, because I think that's something super important for younger attorneys to know, that it might be terrifying what they're doing because they don't know what they're doing, but you
Yeah.
do learn it. And it will be terrifying again when you go try do another big adventure.
Oh my God. If fear wasn't part of our professional lives, God forbid what would happen to us all. But that's okay. It's normal to be scared out of your pants half the time. You're normal if you feel that way.
Yeah. So I'd love to now learn a little bit more about the actual work that you do. Can you share with me what type of entities are you working with when you're creating these different funds?
Typically venture funds. So I'll explain a little bit just quickly about what a typical kind of transaction looks like for me. So my job is to help venture capital firms form investment funds in which many different investors will invest. And a fund is an actual entity. It is typically a limited partnership entity or a limited liability company entity. For us here in the United States, is not always, but most always formed in the state of Delaware, because that's where like the corporate situs is of most businesses here in the United States. That's not universally true. We have funds formed in California and other places, but typically it's Delaware. But there are a number of international clients, and so we'll have to form limited partnerships not only here in Delaware in the United States, but also say the Cayman Islands. So if we've got foreign investors in a United States fund, a lot of time those foreign investors, I should say non-United States investors, will want not to invest directly in the United States, because a lot of times the United States are a bunch of poop heads on a lot of issues, particularly tax issues, that a lot of international investors are quite fearful of. And they don't want to get on the radar screen of the United States IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. And so a lot of times we'll have to structure, not only here in the United States, but outside the US, these limited partnership entities, which really they are entities, but they are flow through from a tax treatment. So the money that they earn are not taxed at the entity level. It flows through. It's a flow through vehicle for tax purposes. And so like a United States fund invests in a portfolio company and they liquidate that investment. The entity, the partnership, isn't taxed, but the money will be distributed up to the fund, to the investors, so that you're only taxed once. And so there's a lot of tax planning that goes into the structuring of these venture funds. And that's really great, because once upon a time, I happened to be a tax lawyer, worked with venture funds. So I do remember a little bit of that. I'm not a tax lawyer any longer, and we have many magnificent tax lawyers here at Sibley that help on some of the more complex aspects of it. But these are entities that are formed to invest in a very tax efficient way. So it'll be a fund. There will be a general partner entity. That is, the fund managers form their own sort of flow through vehicle that they will earn all of their carried interest, management fee, and all the other economic accoutrements that come out of these deals. And then the investors will invest in whatever way they want. The individual people will invest as themselves. Sometimes they'll have family partnerships or trusts. Large institutional investors will have corporations invest, will have pension plans invest, university endowments, sovereign wealth funds. There's so many structures that investors use to invest in our funds. So but it is very much, because there is a lot of tax sensitivity. Structuring is a huge part of the success of these transactions, and knowing exactly what it is, in which jurisdiction you need to be, and which entities to form, and what are the benefits and detriments of both. Those are the kinds of things that, as a fund formation lawyer, you've got to be very cognizant of. So that's a very lawyerly long way of answering your question.
No, good introduction to it. When you are guiding your clients through making these funds, what are some of the most important things that they have to consider, or perhaps some of the most common mistakes that might arise later?
Yeah, I think that the mistakes, that's a good word for it. A lot of these people think of them, and particularly new managers, are as like economic transactions. I think you have to think of it as building a partnership between investors and yourself as a venture fund manager. This truly is a partnership in its truest word, not only from an economic perspective, but from a trust perspective. The limited partners are giving you sizable amounts of capital and are trusting your judgment and experience to invest them in what will be, knock on wood, hopefully successful portfolio companies. A lot of them, a lot of managers, I think, lose sight of that in the process. It becomes about haggling over economics or this term or that term that goes into the agreement. The way in which you do that can say as much about the success of your endeavor as the terms themselves in many respects, and the sort of respect for your counterparty at the opposite side of the transaction. And that boils down to the lawyer level as well. I won't lie and say we don't have deep feelings of animosity going on behind the scenes about certain investors and their counsel, but it always winds up being a level of respect in which we work, because we as lawyers are also need to be mindful of trying to create this partnership in a business friendly way, because these relationships that you're forming on a venture fund, are every fund is going to last 10 years or longer. And so this relationship that you're creating between these investors and these general partners, that's a long-term relationship. And if you do a really bad job of doing that upfront, both from the general partner business level, but also from the lawyer level, that is fraught with danger for many reasons. So I think people tend to forget that, and they really should understand that this is all part of trying to create a great partnership and work towards that as the end goal, and try to see the forest always and not the trees so much. So I think that is usually the biggest mistake I see a lot of managers make. The process itself is again, a lot of times it can be rocket science, but a lot of times it's not. And so I think our job as lawyers is to make things as practical and efficient and flexible as we possibly can as deal lawyers. We're trying to get from point A to point B very quickly, oftentimes. And we don't need to overthink the issue. We have a brand new fund manager. We don't need to give them terms that somebody who's been doing this 20 years has, because they just don't have the organization to deal with a bunch of stuff that we're doing for much more mature businesses. And so I think we as lawyers also need to be cognizant of stylizing our transaction approach based on the client and kind of what they're trying to achieve. So I think that the success always tends to be at its root understanding what your client is and isn't, and styling the transaction in that way. But also, again, having this holistic understanding that there's an end game here, because once we're gone from the transaction, these parties live with each other on a day-to-day basis. And so that needs to be untethered in a way that it's going to be set up for success. And so I think a lot of people, they're too worried about the check that the investor represents and not the investor a lot of times. So you need to understand both.
Yeah, it's super interesting what you said about stylizing the transaction with, say, the amount of terms that you'll give them, and how fund managers can get caught up on terms, perhaps. On that note, what are some of the notable trends that you've seen with fund terms over the years?
Yeah. So I think obviously the main part of any venture fund is the economics that go to the general partner, the carried interest. 2 and 20 is a saying in the industry, to 20% carried interest, 2% management fee. So the general partners of these venture funds earn economics in two different ways. Typically, they earn a profits interest on after we return all capital back to the investors. If there's any profit left over, then they'll take 20% of that. That's the carried interest. But then there's also an annual 2.5% management fee. So those tend to be two huge issues that investors. And so when I started, even in the go days of 1999, it was 2 and 20. It was like they were simple. It was one flat rate for all of it, and we didn't really mess with it too much. But as economies bubbles burst and people retrench and come in and out, they start getting fancy with the way in which they potentially can earn carry and start to incentivize it. So I would say the way in which people think about carry is just a much more varied spectrum you look at now. I think 20% carried interest still is probably the bellwether term, but now there's tiered carry where if your fund performs at a certain level, you go from 20% to 25% or 25 to 30%. And so I think in that way, you've seen carried interest and the way in which there are obligations associated with that sort of earning of the carried interest. There's been some normalizing of, again, not to get hyper technical, but in order to get carry in most funds, you're going to have to return all contributed capital back first. That's a European waterfall. When I was starting out, there's an American waterfall. I don't know if that's a misnomer because we're more greedy, I guess, but it was actually on a deal by deal basis. If you return capital on that deal that the LP, then you got 20% of the profit, regardless of where you were on the rest of your portfolio. That has gone by the way of the dodo. It still exists in certain measures and in certain funds, but a European water. So the structure of kind of the economics has changed a lot. I think it's more protective of the investors, the LP investors in many ways, but also the upside has been a lot more potentially for the GPs if they really outperform. So I would say in that way, economics a lot. Investment restrictions, what funds are investing in. And crypto is a perfect example of this, right? Crypto was not even a thing, obviously, back in 1999. And so we never had to worry about assets like that. But as investments mature and as economies mature and assets mature, there are different things that investors are doing with their dollars. And the things in which venture capitalists invest these days was just mind-blowing. And crypto is a perfect area like that. So knowing and understanding that particular asset class, the dangers of it, the nuances of it, and how to structure economics around it in a venture fund context. And this could be said for making investments, somebody there's much more international investing going on from United States funds outside the US these days because tech communities are developing. Obviously, China until relatively recently was a very significant pocket of capital being invested in by United States funds. So I think just the investment hunting license of these funds is just so much broader than it ever has used to be. That to me is the thing that has changed the most over these years has been what venture funds are investing in. Cannabis industry, a plug for my good friend Snoop Dogg and his incredible firm that he's formed around that. They're just like, that wasn't even something somebody thought about. It was like, my God, you can't smoke marijuana. That's the worst thing in the world. And now things have changed and the world is a different place. And that world is a different place, takes on many different iterations and nooks and crannies. And the venture fund industry has to change and we have to change with it. So I think it's just making sure you're staying on top of all that and knowing what your clients are doing and being very flexible and having an open mind.
Love it. And you mentioned at the start when we were talking about 1999 and then the financial markets going down and a lot of venture capital firms closed down. In relation to that, have there been issues with succession management of these funds? And what have you kind of noticed about what makes successful planning
Yeah.
for these funds?
God, that's a great question. That is such a good question. So I would say in 1999, nobody thought about it at all. People were forming their venture funds. Fund 4, 5, 6, or 7 were so far down the road that it was something that they weren't even thinking about. So it was lousy. Let's be blunt about it. It was god awful. But I think as those funds that were formed in kind of the late 90s and early 2000s, the really successful ones have gotten on to becoming now, instead of funds 1s and fund 2s and fund 3s, they're on fund 11 and 12 and 13 and 14. And there are a lot of painful lessons learned across all of that. And obviously, venture capital firms, like any other business, are bringing in new talent all the time at the associate level, analyst level, becoming principals, becoming partners, becoming general partners. That maturation of the business has happened all the time. And I think one of the real value-added areas in which we have counseled, just based on our experience of the number of firms we've represented, has been this way to do it right. And I think it's also been demanded by the underlying investors in the funds as well, the LPs. They want to know that there is a succession plan for the old guard exiting stage left and the new guard coming online. And some of this gets built into the terms of the fund. There's this provision in every partnership agreement called the key person test, where They'll identify the specific individuals that are part of the investment team that are particularly key. And if these people leave the firm, then there are consequences under the fund agreement, like stopping the investment period or liquidating the fund or some other such thing. So some of it is just demanded by the underlying investors. They're just holding these venture funds' feet to the fire. But judicious planning demands it. I think you have to be prescient about the next generation and what your plan is for that. Now, you have to be careful because there are a lot of people with bright ideas who get into big carry holdings or in the management companies who turn out to be complete duds. So I think you have to have a lot of experience with people before you really bring them into the fold. But once you trust and know that these people are going to be part of your future for a long time, you can never start too early bringing them into the management company or planning for the relative succession of the firm. It has been a crippling effect on a number of firms, and to the point that some firms have actually had to stop investing for material periods in time, where a lot of times the underlying limited partners will not re-up to funds where they believe that there's too much of the old guard on hand and not enough of the new. So, but you shouldn't have to get to that point at this stage. But let's be honest, a lot of this is about ego for a lot of people. And so there are some people who just want to be managing directors till they die. And they built this firm, and by God, they're going to share in it. And sometimes it's just trying to be able to counsel around that ethos and philosophy. And sometimes you're not successful. You do what the clients tells you to do, but you got to offer your perspective that the really great firms now are ones that are thinking about this 2 steps ahead. So your question is just wonderful in that way, very prescient.
Yeah, so it always comes down to that people relationship.
It does. Absolutely.
And so, in your role, do you ever have much insight into the attracting investors to invest in these funds and how these funds might be doing it and what works best?
Yeah. And a lot of it's very, yeah, sure, I do. Absolutely. Because a lot of times we're part of that brain trust, particularly for brand new fund managers who are, if you think about the investment, like the investor target for just different kinds of funds, like brand new emerging managers are typically only looking at high net worth individuals and family offices for capital. They're not yet ready for the big time to be before institutional investors. And typically institutional investors are not often investing in emerging managers. With that said, there are definitely institutions who have programs to do just that. And so it's knowing people that know that and who they are. I have a list of like 70 different institutional investors who have emerging manager programs to be able to make introductions. But a lot of this also is if I'm on fund 4 and 5, I'm usually probably an institutional fund by that point. Most of my capital is coming from pension plans and university endowments and public companies, and it's not people anymore. It's really businesses. And so to be prescient to all that and know where the pockets of capital are flowing and know that usually when you're going from fund 2 to fund 3, this is the time when institutional investors start to invest in you after you've got, and knowing that. So from that standpoint, it's having service providers like myself who know this really well. But there's also professionalization, right? There's placement agents. So you absolutely can hire professional people who this is all they do. They go out and find limited partner commitments for you and they get paid as part of that effort. And so placement agents are definitely something that are used by a lot of funds. I would say not all funds, and I would probably say not the majority of funds, but placement agents do serve a very real purpose. And it might be only a little part of the transaction. Maybe we're able to re-up from a lot of our investors 70% of the capital we can raise ourselves. So maybe we'll hire a placement agent to raise the other 30, right? So there are things like that. And then I also think it's just, again, industry conferences, attending kind of your clients' annual meetings where you're meeting the limited partners and investors and finding out what they're interested in investing and using that intelligence as a lawyer for the benefit of other clients. And I know that this LP is really looking at this particular investment sector and you should probably give them a call. So I think it's just surrounding yourself with people that are really good at that and have that kind of experience. But, and the last part of it is just very large firms have their own investor relations department. They have somebody who's 24/7 interacting with limited partners, doing all the IR relations work. So larger firms, this is actually a silo of work for a lot of people. And we deal with a lot of IR departments in our very big venture fund clients all the time. There are some there are some smaller firms that hire outside IR agencies to do some of this stuff. So it might be helping them do the PPM or the deck, professionalize their approach to some of that. So there are people that in that way that can help proselytize and get your presentation in a way that 24/7 you've got a pulse on the limited partners. So internally, your service provider network, placement agents, and frankly, your own network. By God, one huge thing I would recommend every successful venture capitalist to do is your venture capitalist friends should be more than willing to share their limited partners with you. So work your own network to be able to do that as well. I think that's crucially important. And it's a great piece of experienced advice. Because they want to know, they want to keep their own limited partners happy. And if they can introduce them to a really good new fund, probably not a competitor fund, but somebody that they think can do a good job, they're only solidifying their own relationship with their LPs. So there's so many different ways to approach that and people to look at, but those are the ways in which VCs stay on the pulse of their own limited partners or potential limited partners.
Lots of great tips there. And I'm sure after this episode, there might be a few people who might have sparked a little fire in their eyes that they might be interested in venture law. With that in
Right.
mind, what would be your advice for navigating the industry, or what skills should they develop now to get into that area of law?
Yeah, I think it's just knowing what it is. And so it's not having to be an expert in it, but I think it's really understanding what kind of early stage portfolio companies are and what they do. And it's understanding kind of the venture fund side of it. I think it's just, and again, at a very high level, if you're in law school, take corporate law, tax law classes, partnership classes, things that are surrounded by sort of corporate transactions. There are many wonderful attributes of law school. Probably the best part is meeting lifelong friends, but the rest of it is poppycock. It's not, it really doesn't necessarily prepare you as well as you would like it to for the everyday life of being a lawyer in the real world. But, but you could have a wonderful university that you've attended and made lifelong friends. And law school experience for some truly is transformative. So I don't mean to discount it because it is wonderful in many respects, but you have to do your own detective work on this. And so, what I would say is if I knew then what I know now, I would have taken no environmental courses, still take tax courses because I think it's valuable to have some like a corporate tax course, but take corporate law courses. Actually, there's like accounting for lawyers, finance for lawyers kind of classes. Do that. You might even want to take a course or two from the MBA program at your university. I would. So I think it's just surrounding yourself with business law type of courses. I think if you're in law school, if you have a business law journal, get on that because there's no better way to sort of ingrain yourself in things that are going on in business law. Because I think when you sit in front, if you're a brand new law school graduate sitting in front of somebody like myself, saying you want to do venture capital law, well, that doesn't really mean much if you haven't put the effort into kind of learning what it is and being able to have a conversation with me about what it is I do and the kinds of directionality you have for what your experience has shown you to be an emerging companies lawyer or funds lawyer or not sure yet. So I think you really got to do your detective work and do the work in law school if you can. And if you're a lawyer who's had prior experience and that's really what's led you to this, then by God, rely on that to have the interviews and make the points you need to make in front of the people who are doing the hiring. Because experience, there's nothing better than real life experience in working with a company or in a company to do that. Because the people who do this job, both on the company side and on the fund side, come from so many walks of life. I mean, they are PhD in chemistry or professional athlete or a CPA or somebody like myself is a little mix of all that. You just find what sort of ticks with you and why this particular area interests you and make that a believable story to tell because people will be able to tell the BS from the non-BS when you start to sit in front of people and really investigate if this is something you want to do.
I love it. So much wisdom there that we can draw upon. And to wrap up the episode, I have some quick fire questions where you can
All
tell
right.
me the first thing that comes to your mind, a sentence or a word. So I'll kick it off. If you
Okay.
weren't an attorney, what would be your dream job?
I would be a professional sports broadcaster. Sports are near and dear to my heart, obviously, but I think traveling the world, covering sports and being paid for it, I couldn't imagine a better gig than that. So I would say that, or a photographer. I have a passion for photography as well. So, but probably the sports casting. I think I would love to do that. That would be awesome.
Love it. And what is one movie or book that has had the biggest impact on you?
So there's a movie, well, it's more of a personal reason than it is professional, but there's a movie called Field of Dreams, which stars Kevin Costner. It's a crazy story about Kevin Costner, who's a corn farmer in the middle of Iowa, but a lifelong baseball fan. And it's a story about fathers and sons and belief and hope and taking a risk and craziness of really weird decisions that one makes that turn out to be the best things you've ever done. I think there's a lot of things to draw from inspiration there. But at the end of that movie, every time I never fails, I cry like a baby every time. And so that's the only movie I can say that about, really. But there are just so many parts of my life that are part of that movie, that baseball and father son complexity and just a lot of stuff that makes that movie great. And just obviously wonderful acting by Kevin Costner and James Earl Jones and Charlton Heston, and incredible. So that for me is something that is always near and dear to my heart. So anybody who has never watched it, even if you're not a baseball fan, you don't have to be. By God, get out there and watch that movie. It's fantastic.
I love it. That was a very wholesome answer. And finally, if you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice before starting your career and professional life, what would it be?
Trust yourself, trust your instincts, because they'll never prove you wrong. I think that along the way, I think there are things that there are lefts that I took when my gut said go right, and the lefts almost never worked out, or I went right and should have gone left, and my gut said to go left. I just think you have to trust your own self and know that you're your own best advocate. And I think for me, that is the biggest piece of advice that anyone should be following. I think that you only get to live this life one time, and the truest North Star in it all will just be yourself and your own guiding principles. And so go with your gut always. Go with your gut always.
I love it. Thank you so much, Shane. I've loved our conversation. And if people want to follow along with your new journey at Sidley and see what you're up to, how can they connect with you?
Well, all right. So you can always email anytime you want. The email address is sgoudey, and it's here down in the left corner. So it's sgoudey@sidley, SIDLEY.com. Never feel afraid to give me a call. My phone number is 650-565-7705. Give me a call anytime. That's my work number. But you shoot me an email or find me on LinkedIn, because I am a prodigious user of LinkedIn. You will almost invariably find me there. Just either search up Sidley or Shane Goudey, you'll find me there. So those are the spots to come find me, and I will be happy to talk to anyone, anytime, anywhere.
I love it. Thanks, Shane.
You bet. Sophia, this has been a delight. I really appreciate the time.